Uh, Good morning, everyone, to History Matters, and so does coffee. And I have something here all over the place. And a newbie mug, excellent. Today we're going to talk about something that it's going to be obvious why we want us to talk about it. And I've touched on little bits of this before, but this is coming at it from a different angle. And obviously it's related to a certain someone saying that he, because of the massive fraud that didn't happen at the last election, that justified terminating everything that had to do with elections, including the Constitution. And I, that woke me up in the middle of the night, I will confess. And I was like doing what you shouldn't do in the middle of the night, which is sending, all kinds of social media messages out all over the place. Oh, this is what this means. This is bad. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. I'm going to circle back at the end. But what I mostly want to talk about, the response. Gosh, something lurking. The response was interesting, not necessarily good, but interesting. Some people understood the implications of that. Other people were silent and didn't really respond, which led me to think, what do people think about the Constitution? And not just like, oh yeah, the Constitution makes our government, but really, what do they think the Constitution is? And I think I said this when I put it out on social media, the thingness of the Constitution. How do people really conceive of it? What do they think of above and beyond what it does to structure our government? What is it? And this is a topic that has always been interesting to me because, and I've said this a lot in my American Revolution course, that it is the American colonists were very paper-minded, charter or constitution-minded people, because the colonies that are ultimately become states, they're created ultimately on paper charters, right? And power in one way or another is potentially maybe given to a proprietor or a corporation, but the colonies are begun with these charters. I even went and read some charters this morning so that I could have a sense of what the charters sounded like. And largely, it's certainly the ones I looked at particularly the Georgia sort of corporate orders charter from 1732. I think I wrote that down here. Yes, the corporate charter, April 1732, from King George, which is where Georgia comes from. That's what it's named after. And then I looked at the Georgia Constitution from 1777. And, the charters aren't really constitutions. So let's not get that confused, but they are paper documents that describe powers that the proprietor or the corporation has, describe the relationship between the colony and the mother country. So they are structuring documents. Let's put it that way. They're not constitutions, but they are structuring documents. So colonists, by definition, they're here and they know that they're here because of this paper document. They also have, generally speaking, a more immediate relationship with their government because the colonies are small and people know people. And so it's not as though, Parliament is far away and you're somewhere in Northern England. You're probably at some kind of a center of density in a colony near where the government meets. So paper-minded, and also people had a sense of what the government was, who the government was. And I think that idea, that you have rights and structures of government on paper is an idea that stuck around. And it makes sense that there's a long tradition of Americans being constitution-minded or paper documents. I don't know what to call it. Not quite charter-minded, not necessarily constitution-minded, but you get my drift, I think. So charters are statements of privileges. They're not acts of government in and of themselves. They don't define structures of government, but when you look at what happens as the United States, well, not the United States, as the colonies get engaged in the American Revolution, they declare independence, and then they immediately get to constitution writing, which on the one hand makes perfect sense because they've just basically declared independence and cut out the royal government that has been governing in different ways in different colonies, these colonies, as long as they've been there. Okay, well, once that's gone, that's the government. And so immediately there's now not colonies once you declare independence, but I suppose you could say states frantically trying to figure out what they want their constitutions to look like, what should be in them. John Adams early on writes a constitution that in some ways would be really familiar to us, that has 3 branches, and some of the other people, when he's in the Continental Congress, some of the other people there are like, hey, John, can I see that constitution you did? Because I don't know, people are saying it's a pretty good constitution. So they're literally trying to figure out how to do something different, which is put on paper the actual structure of government. Now, a lot of these early constitutions, they had very strong legislatures because this is the revolution and Americans are wary of strong executive power. So some of these early constitutions get sort of finagled with ultimately. But I've always thought it's really striking. I mean, in a way, it's very logical, but declare independence, instantly begin writing constitutions. So Americans, I think, have a sense of corporateness, not necessarily meaning like business, but kind of a sense of a we created by these constitutions. They like to see written on paper what rights are. And so someone asked me, I can't even remember when, at some point in the distant past, given the million bazillion episodes that we've done, what did the Anti-Federalists contribute to the Constitutional Convention? And my answer was the Bill of Rights, because they were worried about assigning that much power, and they wanted in writing a declaration of what the government that was being created could not do. So in all of these ways, a constitution isn't just, okay, now we have 3 branches of government and here's what they do. It's a document that sort of creates an entity, and people belong to that entity in a sense. They don't sign, their names on, but they essentially sign on to some kind of corporate location. John Adams, as I said earlier, was particularly engaged in this. And this morning, I just found a wonderful phrase that I must share with you because it's very John Adamsy, and I don't think I'd heard it before. So 1780 is when the Massachusetts Constitution is accepted. 1779, he writes a letter to his friend Benjamin Rush, and he says he is a, quote, constitution monger. He says something like, oh, my new job as a constitution monger, which I just kind of love. Like, now that I'm Mr. Constitution. So from the very beginning, from colonial charters, Americans have the sense of, we are created as a we on paper, and we hold that governments and power, we hold those pieces of paper are ways to limit it. We hold people responsible to those agreements on those pieces of paper. I didn't do this morning, but you can look and see all of the times in which different states had another constitutional convention to change their constitution, to update it in some way or another. It's an ongoing mission. You get into the 1790s, and as soon as I said that today I was going to be talking about the thingness of the Constitution, I thought of good old Alexander Hamilton, and that's not just because it's Alexander Hamilton. One of the things he was really worried about was, and he's not the only one, what makes a constitution different from any other legislative act? So, okay, here's a bill, it was passed. Like, how will we differentiate that in its importance from any other government document? And he was worried, as he would, given his concern all the time about centralized power and the power of the government, somehow or other, we need to explain to people, to have them understand that the Constitution is something above and beyond, that it's a special kind of a document. It's something that needs to be protected. It has its own ranking of some sort. He was very worried about that. And when you see in the 1790s, granted, he always, not always, often responds in an extreme manner to things that happen in the 1790s, kind of goes off and also tends to leap for military solutions to civic problems, which is really not wonderful. But one of the things he's worried about in the 1790s is things that happen that might suggest that the Constitution isn't strong, or, never mind the government. He wants the government to appear strong, but he wants people to understand the significance of the Constitution as the government, the creation of the government. It's part of why he goes ballistic after, and at this point, he's no longer in office. When you get the Alien and Sedition Acts, by this point, Hamilton's out of office and he's kind of behind the scenes advising President John Adams' cabinet. So he's not responsible for the Alien and Sedition Acts, but you get the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in response, thanks to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And although they don't both use the word nullify, what the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions basically say is that if something is unconstitutional, that the states have the right to nullify or to, not obey a law that is passed, which Hamilton goes ballistic. I don't know if I've cited this document before. I cited it in my undergraduate class. Forgive me if I cited it before, but it shows the degree to which Hamilton was really, really upset at the implications of, essentially, they don't use the word terminate. Nullify isn't quite terminate, but still, it's saying we are not going to follow this thing that just passed. We don't like it. We don't think it's constitutional. We're going to interpret the Constitution as we see fit. He writes a letter, and right now I'm not going to remember who it's to, in the midst of this. And he says in the letter, here's what needs to happen now. It's going to be extreme and people didn't do it. He says, first of all, someone needs to write a little pamphlet that explains why the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions are bad, and explains in some way, I suppose, the Constitution. And he says something in the letter like, this needs to get to every fireside in Virginia. So he's very focused on Virginia. And by this point, with Madison and Jefferson being Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, he really does see Virginia as the nest of sort of danger against government. So he's like, okay, so we need to write this little thing. We need to get it into every fireside so people can read it and understand what's going on. And then the other thing we need to do is get up some kind of a military force and put the Virginia government, the people who are agreeing with these Kentucky and Virginia, in this case, Virginia resolutions, his phrase, I believe, is put them to the test of resistance. So he says, I'm not interested in attacking Virginians generally. Oh, no. Like, we don't want to do that. But the people who are actually saying that they're basically going to nullify part of the Constitution, let's march troops in there and show them that you can't do that, which if someone else said it, one might be more aghast. It's Hamilton. And he, he has sort of a knee-jerk impulse if something happens that he thinks is threatening the authority of the government or the power and authority of the Constitution. That's his solution, is get the military. You have the Whiskey Rebellion too, and Hamilton is out there in front saying, we gotta get out there, we gotta crush them, we gotta show them that the government stands strong, that the Constitution created is powerful, that you can't just do whatever you want, that there's some kind of an authority. Now, I'm making fun of Hamilton because he's like Mr. Strong Central Government, Mr. Extreme. But if you think about the fact that, it's part of what I guess what upset me about the terminating part of the Constitution comment. We take a lot for granted with that Constitution, right? We kind of assume in some ways It'll always be there, maybe now a little bit less. But generally speaking, I don't think we think very hard about our Constitution. We think about rights and duties within the Constitution, right? We think about, does the state have this power? Does the federal government have this power? That's federalism. We think about that all the time. And the Constitution is deliberately vague on that front. Part of how it got passed is, okay, it's not as though the national government has all power, that the states also are sovereign, and this will be figured out as we go. So on the one hand, we do think about it in that way, but we take it for granted. And what you see in the 1790s, not just with Hamilton, is this is a document that, like, I and a bunch of people I know went into a room and sort of came up with an idea, and then we got people to ratify it, and now we're testing it. And why the heck should this survive? I mean, think about the newness of it. I know I've talked about the experimental nature of this period, but I want to emphasize that now, not as a sort of throwaway word, but this is an era, going back to what I said at the beginning of my comments, of constitution making. People see constitutions as important. They're making constitutions. They're changing constitutions. We need another constitution. And the American Constitution that sort of creates a we the people, that was created in the very recent past. And I'm going to say the word. If people are playing bingo, someone will get bingo. It's high extreme contingency in this time period, meaning, I know I can see the response, bingo, yes. And if there's anyone who's new here, folks play bingo every week because I'm very predictable. And some of the words I'm going to say in contingency, although last week I think I didn't say it, one of those words.
Well, they're kind of freaking out because you didn't say partner in crime and we didn't give the rules of the game.
Oh no!
On the camera because I didn't know what to do. I was like, okay, do I just stay? Like,
oh, I totally forgot.
But it's great because they can't get bingo. And they're flipping out in the chat.
Anyway.
I
totally forgot that. I knew something was wrong. I knew something was wrong. I missed it.
I just forgot to turn my camera off.
Anyway.
It's going. You're on a roll. It's good.
I'm on a roll. I'm talking about the Constitution being truly an experimental document, in the sense that, maybe it won't be around in a couple of years. I remember coming across a letter when I was researching my first book. I think it was to James Madison. And I will say, this is like, 30 years ago. So my letter brain, excellent letter brain. Someone wrote to Madison and said something along the lines of, if this government lasts 5 years, here's what I think we ought to do. And that brings you up short, right? There aren't a lot of assumptions about the Constitution and its power. There's an understanding of the significance of it. There's big concern about the fragility of it. There's kind of a vague sense that if it doesn't work, there's a lot of talk of, like Jefferson, when I talked about the election of 1800 last week, and he said, well, something had gone wrong with the election. We'd have some kind of convention, and then we'd, Constitution would have wound down and we'd wind it back up, just fix it up a little bit. But what I'm saying here largely is constitutions were front and foremost. They did an actual job. People were worried about what would happen if they didn't do that job. They thought about constitutions all the time. And there's a reason why it starts with we, the people. The Constitution constitutes we, the people. It creates a we. And that's part of what was so terrifying about it to people at the time. Like, what do you mean a national we? Like, states, we're parts of states. I don't know about this national we. It was scary. And which is why the word national does not really appear in the original Constitution, because that's a scary word, because that suggests somehow or other states are going to be subsumed. But the Constitution creates a we the people of the United States. That's a major thing. And, I'm going to use this word not with any great implications. What sometimes if you say the Constitution is a kind of contract, there's a lot of legal scholarship and other kinds of scholarship that, boom, is it a contract? I'm not sure if it's a contract. Shall we discuss if it's a contract? And I'm not interested in that argument. But what I do want to say is it is a kind of contract, not just between the American people and the government, but that we make with each other. we all essentially sign on to that pact by being American citizens, or at least we're supposed to. It's a kind of, somewhere in my most recent book, I talk about how the Union is grounded on faith and a sense of fairness, and that there's not a lot else holding it together, really, that there's a sort of sentiment at the heart of what we consider to be the big we, the United States. And the Constitution represents that as an entity, gives concrete form to that idea that there is a we. And that's why, that there's a kind of contract that we have with each other and that we have with the government. That's part of why when I woke up in the middle of the night and kept thinking about terminate part of the Constitution, I went ballistic and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. But that's because the Constitution is us, right? Not only does it create the government, and the obvious problem, if you're going to terminate part of the Constitution, you're just overthrowing the government. I mean, there's hard to look at it in any other way, but it creates a we the people. It's such a criminal thought. It's such an extreme thought. And the fact that there was a lot of silence in response to it, it hurt, because it suggested to me, and granted, there are all kinds of reasons why people are being silent, particularly some on the right are being silent when we wish they would not be, and I'm not going to go into that at all. But if someone uses that word and makes that comment about the Constitution, that should hurt everyone. That's a wound, threat of a wound being inflicted on the nation. And we don't know, what kind of wound that's going to be, or what the shape of the body of the people will be after that. It's so, I wrote, when I was trying to think about what I wanted to talk about today, I wrote thingness, which kind of gets at what I really want to talk about. And then I wrote import, meaning, maybe symbolism. Like, what is the thing I want to talk about? And all of those things are what I'm talking about. And symbolism sounds like a highfalutin kind of a word that people sitting around in a room being intellectuals think about. But some symbols, national symbols, have a concrete importance. They serve a concrete function in addition to creating the government. They constitute something, right? Constitution, they constitute something, they create something. So Americans, my larger point here is today, Americans have always been charter or constitution minded. They've always understood that they have certain rights in one way or another, not just the Bill of Rights. Over the years, I've discovered on social media that some people think the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. They don't know that there's more than the Bill of Rights. So, the Constitution is part of the Constitution mindedness of the United States. And maybe we kind of think along those lines, but I think at this point, people don't really fully understand what the Constitution is or what it does, which is why you can believe it's just rights, the Bill of Rights. And as I've said before, the Bill of Rights is not, I have all of these rights. The Bill of Rights is the government can't take these rights away from me. And that's a different thing entirely. So at any rate, I'm meandering a little bit this morning because I guess obviously I feel rather strongly about this. But constitutions matter. They constitute a national people in our case. Threatening to terminate part of it is a physical assault on the body politic. It wounds the body politic. It should hurt to think about that. It should make people catch their breath. It's not something that you should say lightly. It's not something that most of us have heard before, and there's a reason. So I say all of this only as on one hand, a kind of exploration of all of the ways in which constitutions matter that aren't just about creating three branches of government and checks and balances, and to foster in everyone who happens to be watching this or will be watching it when it goes up online, gets archived, to foster an understanding of the deeper fundamental value of what the Constitution is, what it represents, the fact that it kind of creates a we, and that on a very basic level that maybe we don't think about very often, we signed on to that pact as American citizens, and we don't agree necessarily what that pact says, and people have very strong feelings about that, and we amend that pact from time to time. So I'm not saying that everyone signs on to the pact and then we're all a bunch of happy people who all agree with everything. I'm not saying that at all, but the basic fact of that Constitution matters. And I guess that's the larger point that I want to drive home. Okay, now I will do what I'm supposed to do. I don't know. I think I'm not caffeinated enough. I missed my partner in crime at the beginning. Now I've said it, so someone got bingo. Okay, so for those of you, if any of you, yes, mug. For those of you, if there are any folks here who are new, what is this, 133 weeks, 134? 134? 140. We've been doing this for 140 straight weeks. 100 and okay, so for 140 weeks, I can't hear you, Annie. You're muted.
I said 140. That's a contribution right there.
That's 140 straight weeks. So for all of those weeks, I believe, I present a mug that is thematically related to whatever I'm talking about. I do not own 140 mugs. So there are some repeat mugs, multiple repeat mugs, and some of the folks here in our History Matters community have sent me mugs, and I didn't buy this for myself, so I'm gonna guess someone got it for me, and I never remember. I don't know who. Okay, but it couldn't be more appropriate. It's not even officially a mug.
Ooh.
It's the Constitution.
It's awesome.
It's the Constitution, although it doesn't really get past Article.
They call that a tumbler? What do they call that kind of glass? I'm not a bar.
I guess that's a tumbler, right? I don't know. But so if someone out there is watching and actually gave this to me, I know I didn't buy it. So I don't know who gave it to me. But anyway, I could not have a more appropriate drinking thing than this.
Is there anything extra in that cup today?
No, it's my, I actually went and got fancy coffee, fancy, as Francesca said, rather than make my own. So it is a little early for a tumbler. Yeah, this is pretty coffee. It's coffee.
It's already tomorrow in Australia, just saying.
No, I'm really not.
I'm just teasing you. Well, we do have some questions. People finally started waking up and adding questions. Are you ready?
I hope so.
I hope so too. Okay, so our first question is sort of a combination of two. So our dear friend Francesca and Cece, longtime participants, both commented on the fact that Britain does not have a written constitution, and which they say, Cece says it causes issues. A constitution exists based on case law. So what they're both wondering is, how did the founders even come up with the idea of writing one if they came from Britain that did not have a written constitution?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it was a practical matter, because, granted, yes, that the formal tradition is not to have that absolute written document, but first of all, they start out with a written document, charters, and if you cross out, eliminate Great Britain, you have to create a government somehow. So I mean, it honestly, on a very basic level, in addition to the ways in which I think Americans believe that constitutions mattered, they literally had to create a new government. They just eliminated the royal government. So now there they were. So they had to do something, and they were thinking about it. And, as I mentioned during my comments, in some cases like Pennsylvania, the legislative branch was really powerful, and that didn't necessarily work so well. And had to be kind of a balance, and the executive branch was made weak, and then they had to be given some power. So they're kind of still experimenting, even as they're making constitutions. But I think part of the answer to that question is they had to create a government. I can't imagine they were like, you know what, or you can just kind of sit in a room and make this up and not write it down. I think there's a practical component in addition to the fact that Americans were in the midst of a battle over what their rights were as colonists and as a people, so that of course they wanted to get on paper and preserve on paper who they were, what they felt their rights were, and what they felt their government should be, state by state.
Okay, this next one's a little bit long.
Okay.
From our friend Dave. He talks about Article 1, Section 4, and he quotes it. Times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. Okay, so he's starting with that quote.
Okay.
He says, Congress recently passed legislation trying to get ahead of SCOTUS, things like marriage and privacy. And so he asks, what can Congress do, given that Article 1, Section 4 addresses the independent state legislature decision? Words on paper, okay, but we need to be interpreted by SCOTUS.
Okay, well, so that's a couple of different questions. First, let me address the independent state legislature issue. The idea that somehow or other state legislatures have the power to decide elections in one way or another, which is based on non-existent documents. There's just nothing. It's an attempt to give states a remarkable degree of power to ultimately, potentially, act against democratic elections. It's dangerous. I mean, it's truly dangerous. So the independent state legislature theory is one thing, which is this idea that states have a certain kind of power that they didn't necessarily have. The other part of the question was, what can Congress do? So one of the things that's worth remembering is it took a while for elections of all kinds to be regulated and had on the same day, for one thing, and different states had different modes still of electing people, right? How do you choose electors? Do electors choose electors? Do people vote directly for members of Congress? There are a lot of state level modes of conducting elections in one way or another that still differ. In the early period, they differed a lot, and people were still trying to figure out how to finesse the system. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, I believe they were voting directly for I'm going to get this wrong. Anyway, I'm going to make a stab, but it might be wrong. I believe they were voting directly either for members of Congress or for the members of their state legislature, but names. And a fellow Jeffersonian Republican named John Beckley and friends of his wrote out ballots with the names of the people who the Jeffersonian Republicans wanted to win, all spelled correctly, so no one could say, oh, there's missing an O, that, all of the things that people can do in elections. I think they made 20,000 ballots that they then gave out to people. All you got to do is submit it, and you've got all the right people on your ballot and you voted. There are all kinds of interesting, I don't think I've used the word shenanigans very often, but from the very beginning, it's one of the things that's one of the many vulnerabilities of a democracy is, I've said before, public opinion matters. You can warp public opinion. The electoral process is the free and fair electoral process is at its heart and can be warped in a variety of different ways. Again, which is why something else I've talked about quite frequently, the fear of demagogues, that, some demagogue can get people to agree with him or believe what he is saying, and then the people will sign on to him rather than to the Constitution and the system as it exists. And then who the heck knows what happens to anything in the nation, the rule of law or whatever. You might end up with a dictator of some sort. So at any rate, it's a very roundabout answer. You can tell that this is the end of the academic year. My brain is like, I'm keeping up, but somehow in the back of my brain, some part of me is like, going. Oh, Joanne, you could do this. Anyway, so two separate questions: independent state legislature theory and what can Congress do? And I'm just emphasizing the fact that states still have variety as to what happens in elections in a very general kind of a sense.
All right, that was a good one. Okay, this one comes from Cece, because at one point I was begging Cece to desperately help me add questions. So Cece and then Dave added like 15 questions. So, okay, it says describing the Constitution as a contract is interesting because people break those a lot, especially ex-presidents, not contractors. That was her little side comment. So the fact that we have to buy in to make it work, doesn't that make democracy really, really fragile?
Well, so once again, a couple things. So I used the word contract and hedged it in with all kinds of but kind of exceptions, because I don't want to suggest it's a formal contract that you create and you sign on to, and then in a formal way it can be violated. But is it basically a pact that is very fragile? Yeah. I mean, what protects the Constitution, really? Right? I mean, you could say, well, one would think that the Supreme Court would be thinking about constitutional precedent and thinking in a sweeping way about what the Constitution represents, as opposed to, well, I'm going to stop right there because I'm going to get angry. At any rate, and this is a family show, which you would have said at the beginning, Annie, if I'd remembered.
We are a family. We are a family. We're a community.
We are. Anyway, I've now totally lost track of what I'm saying because I got too engaged with.
That's okay. I think we got it.
Okay.
Okay. The next 4 questions, well, 3 questions because Dave made a typo. Okay, but I'm going to skip one because I really want to know the answer to this one. Dave's just curious, Dr. Freeman, who are your favorite go-to legal historians who specialize in the Constitution when you're doing your research?
Richard Bernstein. My friend Richard Bernstein. He's one. I don't know. Jack Rakove would be another. Very much so. This is tricky because I'm going to leave someone out because I'm sitting here only half caffeinated.
We won't tell them.
Okay, so Saul Cornell is another one. Jack Rakove is I guess I would say really prominent as a constitutional authority. But Rosie Zagari, who I've talked about before here, she was one of the people. As a matter of fact, you can go online and find the brief that I signed on to that was amicus brief to the Supreme Court, and I would say that many of the people on that list, Jonathan Guinap is another one, Mary Bilder is another one. A lot of the people who signed on to that are people who I greatly admire for their constitutional knowledge. I'm on that list, and I would not say I have the constitutional knowledge that some of those scholars have, but that would be a great way to get a list of really leading thinkers.
So Tim, we need the link. I know Tim can find it.
It's out there. I found it.
It is. He'll find it. Okay, so Dave has 2 more questions, and if anybody else wants to put one in, we've got a few more minutes. Okay, Dave asked if words such as those posted on a social network matter when they come from a former president suggesting the Constitution should be terminated. Could a former president be impeached for that? And he says, I think there was a judge who was already retired who still got impeached after he retired.
So there are several unknowns. I don't formally know the answer to this. What's interesting is, in part, that former President Trump is the first tweeting president, really, and tweeting president meaning like literally doing governmental things on Twitter. So what that means, and what that means when he is no longer president, I don't know. So I actually, what's interesting about the times we live in and terrifying about the times we live in is that again and again and again and again, something happens and we're left asking that precise kind of question. So if someone says that on social media, is that like, can that be acted on or not? Particularly if a former president says that. I don't know the answer to that, but we face that kind of question all the time, in part because of technology, right? And the fact that we're ever sort of running to catch up with changes in technology. Who the heck knows what's going to happen next on Twitter and what new question it'll raise about, is this allowed? So I don't know the answer, in part because technology makes that a hard question to answer. I don't know.
Yeah.
I will find out with you how people are going to interpret that. And it might even be a question that's going to have to be argued and then interpreted.
All right. All right. We have a question from Tim, who just ran out the door. So he's not even going to be here to listen to the answer to his own question. He
Okay.
said, I would be curious about your reaction to the Supreme Court hearing on the current independent legislator case. Like just the fact that it got that far up the flagpole for them to be the ones now deciding.
I do not think that should be happening. I am not an authority on what the Supreme Court should and shouldn't do. So I say that as a person who's angry about that theory getting any credence and thus, feeling that it shouldn't be considered by the Supreme Court, but I can't hold forth in a definitive kind of a way. I don't like it. I don't think it should be happening. Who was it? It was Justice Sotomayor who said, someone said, one of the attorneys arguing in the favor of that theory said, I'm not going to do it justice, but said something like, well, you could say that blah, 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 defending the theory. And I believe Justice Sotomayor said, yeah, you could say that if you ignored the history. He's so happy. Yeah.
That's a mug. That's a mug right there. Okay. Yay. Bailey and Liz, thank you for adding some new questions. Okay. Bailey asked, she says, relating to one of Dave's prior questions, speaking in general, have oaths of office usually been seen as self-terminating at the end of a given tenure of office, or has it been assumed to be the life independent of how long one serves? Are there any examples of history where this has come up?
You guys are back into the tricky question.
They're awake. They're awake.
Woo. It's a good question. I'm going to say my gut response is that it holds to when you're in office because it's an oath of office.
Right.
But someone could pop up and say, no, legally, but I would believe it relates to when you are in office. But again, we have a different kind of ex-president right now. So there will be things that people will have to decide, and we won't know what's going to happen. And the roller coaster of the historical present will continue. And all of that's a good question. Who knows? Yeah, I love Justice Sotomayor too, Ellen. At any rate, right. So Dave says U.S. military can retire but be recalled to service. Yeah, well, right. So there's different kinds of oaths. I don't have the formal answer to that, but I assume that it has to do with when you're in office. But if the military, if you can be called back, that might be a different kind of an oath.
But is that an oath, or when you're in the military? I kind of feel like with the military, you sort of know that going in. They sort of tell you, we can call you back in at any time. Like I remember my nephew, when he got out, he did get called back in.
But Dave is saying it's an oath. I mean, by oath, I think people are talking here, or at least as I'm understanding it, literally, hand on the Bible or on whatever you put your hand on, and swearing to, uphold your job and often the Constitution.
Said she worked for the federal government and that they didn't unswear her when she retired.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. One comes from Liz. It says, earlier today, you mentioned how colonists probably generally had a much closer relationship with local government due to how geographically small the colonies were, and everyone knew each other. She said, I've often pondered what effect this may have had on the preponderance of resistance and revolutionary thought or actions. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting. I remember sort of thinking about this as a grad student. There are a lot of rebellions. Bacon's rebellion, Leisler's rebellion in the late 17th century and early 18th century. In the different colonies, there are a lot of rebellions, and sometimes the rebellions are people who feel that they're entitled to something that they're not getting, which is part of this same idea, right? Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, I think 1693. Nathaniel Bacon is a sort of, wealthy-ish, not quite noble-ish, but, he's someone who comes to Virginia and then assumes he's going to get certain kinds of land, certain kinds of power that he feels he deserves. And the angry young men who join with him, as one historian puts it, they feel they're entitled to something. And when they don't get that something, they know, the government's right down the street. They know who those people are. They attack essentially Jamestown, right? They attack the government. They wage war in one way or another. So part of the answer to that question, if I'm getting the question correctly, is there are a lot of rebellions in the colonies, partly because people feel that they understand and know the government and the people in the government, partly because in some way or another, they feel entitled to certain things that, again, a charter would make you feel that way as well, even though the charter doesn't. Charters are mostly, as a matter of fact, the Georgia charter, which I read this morning, let me tell you, waking up on a Friday morning and reading the Georgia Charter of 1732, I'm very proud of myself. But what it mostly does is talk about the powers bestowed on the man who will be the proprietor, and what he can do or what he does. Actually, I read the Maryland charter as well. At any rate, they're not creating governments, but they are saying here's where power goes in a colony.
Yeah. Okay, this one comes from our good friend Kathleen. She says, what were Madison, Hamilton, and the Federalists' initial opposition to the Bill of Rights? And does today's interpretation by some of what the rights are make their opposition valid?
Ask the question for me again. I was too busy checking the chat. This is why I close it when I give my comments.
That's right. She's asking, what were the reasons that Madison and Hamilton, the Federalists, were so strongly against the Bill of Rights, and is what's going on now maybe validating that opposition that they had?
Well, so one of the reasons that they were against a Bill of Rights is pragmatic. And, the idea was, well, the government only has the power that's granted to the government in the Constitution. So why do we need a Bill of Rights saying it doesn't have powers that it doesn't have anyway, which is kind of a short-sighted argument, actually. Part of it, I think, had to do with the practicality of it. Really, we're going to do this now, Bill of Rights. At what ultimately pushed that envelope, first of all, it was the one thing that the Anti-Federalists agreed on. And also, some states had their own bills of rights. So there was a tradition for it. So I think it was, it's interesting coming from Hamilton saying, well, the government only has the power that's in the Constitution. And then he's Mr. Broad Construction, right? It's like, what can the Constitution do? The question is, what can't the Constitution do? But that was part of the reason why they didn't want to pause for that. And that's why it was one of the first things that the first Congress did. Is that states came up with different ideas for what should be in the Bill of Rights, and Congress acted.
All right, here's one from our friend Jen. She says, could a statement link President Trump's on terminating the Constitution trigger the 14th Amendment in terms of disqualifying him for office by acting against the government?
I have no idea. I really don't, so again, the Constitution is a document. It is words on paper. There are people who want to, originalists, just focus on what was meant at the time it was created, the words on paper. But the fact of the matter is, the Constitution is interpreted, as many, many, many people say, it's a living document. It changes based on interpretation, not even only by the Supreme Court, but in other ways as well that might end up getting taken to the Supreme Court. But there's a reason why there was an amendment process written into the Constitution, right? There was an assumption. They didn't assume in the founding period, we will do this thing and it will never need to be changed ever again. They definitely wanted a constitution to be above and beyond, something with a different kind of political and cultural and even social power to it. But they also assumed that as time went on, there would have to be changes made and they couldn't predict what they were.
All right, we have 2 more questions from Dave. I think we can clear the deck. How can we, the people, sign onto a pact that many think is limited to the Bill of Rights, being ignorant of history?
Before you finish the question, because I just want to answer one quick thing, because Richard said the founders didn't all agree on what it meant. How can we abide by their sentiments? Thank you. I've said this before. I've talked about the founder blob. There is no founder blob. So I'm interrupting you, Annie, only so because I'm sitting here saying the founders, and I want to make it clear there is no founder blob. So it's not like they all agreed on what I'm talking about here. So that's an important point. Thank you, Richard. Okay, I'm sorry. Go.
Yep. Okay. Dave is asking, how can we, the people, sign on to a pact that many think is limited to just the Bill of Rights? Being ignorant of history and civics seems to be problematic for a functioning democracy.
Yes. Yes. I mean, to be totally honest, I know I've told this story before, but the main reason that I went and became active on Twitter was because I tweeted out something that felt to me blazingly obvious about 3 branches of government, checks and balances, and each branch has different responsibilities. And I apologized for what I was saying, right? I was like, I know everyone knows this, but I'm going to say it anyway in case some people don't. I apologized before I said it. I apologized after I said it. And then people responded and said, thank you for explaining that to me. I never fully understood that. And then I decided I was just going to stick around on Twitter, because if people really don't know that, or, over the years that I've been on Twitter, I don't know what I'm going to do now about Twitter, it's a different question. But back when Twitter was somewhat normal, people would say like, well, the Bill of Rights is the Constitution, or they didn't understand that they were 2 different things. And some of the things that people insist on, again, this is Twitter, so everything gets hedged in, but people say all kinds of things, and I think, at least in some cases, they're not just trolling, they actually believe them. And it's because in some cases, where would they learn differently, right? I mean, I don't know if, and this is always a longer debate about, are people still teaching civics? Have civics classes really been cut away? What should history classes do? And I don't want to rummage my way into that debate, because that's a debate that should be partly being held by the teachers in the middle of it. But there is a fundamental lack of knowledge, really fundamental lack of knowledge about our government, that it has 3 branches, what each branch does, what the Bill of Rights is. Even just the idea of freedom of speech, right? That freedom of speech, according to some people, means you can say whatever you want and not get in trouble for it. Yeah. That's not what freedom of speech is. No. The government can't clamp down on what you can say, what you want to say, and the government can't clamp down on it. However, you're accountable for what you say. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, you're accountable for that. If you insult someone and they charge you with defamation, you're responsible for that. So the idea that freedom of speech means no accountability for what you say is so 2022. It's like the essence. It's like ode to 2022, right? Like no accountability. We live in this moment of a crisis of accountability, and it makes perfect sense that bonkers idea of free speech is part of it.
All right, I'm going to combine a Gloria and a Kay question because they're very similar. Kay says, in recent years, the alt-right has been asking for a new constitutional convention. And Gloria asks, has the 14th Amendment created a new constitution, or is the 1787 one out of date?
Well, I don't believe what someone said to me on some social media platform yesterday. The Constitution is a dead rag and we should get rid of it. I'm sorry. I don't think it's a dead rag. But this is something I think about and don't quite know what to do with, about having a new convention. That kind of terrifies me, because for that to happen, there has to be an equal and equivalent investment in rules of how that would work. And right now, we're not having a really good moment for rules of the game. So I don't know how that would proceed. Do I think that we should somehow or other do that? I don't know. I just don't see it as being feasible right now. And I can't get beyond that. I will say, if you believe that you can amend the Constitution, sometimes pretty dramatically, if there's a spectrum of changing the Constitution, we're just moving along the spectrum. But I don't know. I can't fathom it in the climate that we're in right now, where some of the people are pushing the envelope or actually just totally ignoring the envelope in so many ways, that I would be very nervous about what would happen if you start tinkering with power in that fundamental a way.
Yeah. And people are giving a nod to Eric Foner's great book about the 14th Amendment.
Yes, indeed.
So if we sell 3 books today, Eric Foner, you can send us a check. Okay, last question. We're going to clear the deck. Thank you, Dave. He's asking, are there any SCOTUS decisions in history that were just flat out ignored? He thinks President Jackson had a quote about SCOTUS decisions he didn't like and the effect that it, he wasn't going to enforce the decision. But he's just wondering, are there any times either where they were ignored or where SCOTUS went too far and people just didn't pay attention?
Well, I mean, I'll answer. It's a huge question that I'll answer in a small way. It is one thing for the Supreme Court to say something, and another thing, and this is Jackson, like, let them enforce it. That people do X. Okay, now enforce it. The Supreme Court can make rulings of various sorts. What happens after that? What happens with protests? What happens on the state level? How states respond? We started out with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, among other things. My answer would be that there have been all kinds of responses to Supreme Court decisions. I mean, just look at the Fugitive Slave Act, and not coming down from the Supreme Court, but still. So actually, and ultimately, the Supreme Court weighs in on whether Black Americans are citizens or not, or are humans or not. And people in the North just said, no, we're not. We're just not going to abide by that. We're going to do what we can to help actual people who are here. So I would say, again, I can't sit here, particularly after I taught my last class of the semester, and put my finger on specific cases. But just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't mean it's going to be enforced. And then that leads to a bigger question. So then what happens, right? The Supreme Court, always was seen in the founding period as the weakest branch. It's kind of, doesn't have the power of the purse or the power of the military. But as ever, if you're talking about governments, if you're talking about constitutions, if you're talking about legislation, it's one thing to declare something and then another thing to enact it and enforce it.
We cleared the deck, kids.
Da-da-da.
So I think it's time to segue. It's 11:02.
Oh, and there I see Gloria. Yes. Lindsay Chervinsky is great. That is very nice that you said nice things about me. And I say hello right back to her. So, yes, I don't know. I miss things that are happening because I'm trying so hard to focus on the questions. Okay, so what is going to happen now? What is going to happen now? I'm not going to forget this part. So now we are going to move into the after party. And what that means is we will no longer be recording what's going on here so that we can be even more freer and easier than we are already. And if you have beamed in, yes, indeed, Carolee, if you have beamed in on the NCHE website, just stay right where you are and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and join us at ncheteach.org/conversations. And that will get you into the after party. As ever, particularly given the subject today, thank you for being here on a Friday morning to talk about democracy, to talk about the Constitution, to talk about some pretty fundamental things that are being talked about in ways that are meaningful and that need to be talked about more, thought about more. The implications need to be considered more. Thank you for being here for this, creating this kind of community of democracy where we talk about the times we live in and how we understand democracy in this time. Thank you for being here. I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful week. I know some people are coming to, I'm seeing like my friends saying so-and-so is awesome. I'm like, oh yes, Richard Bernstein's awesome. I'm kind of like enjoying seeing people praising all my friends and I can't sign off. At any rate, Gerard is slipping not going to the after party. Goodbye, Gerard. At any rate, we are now going to go to the after party. Have a wonderful week and I will see you next week.
Okay. John has to stop recording and turn off Facebook. There we go.
Okay. Still recording.